Today we're going to build this DIY TV stand, media console, credenza thing on Foureyes. I'm going to show you a few different ways you could build this TV stand, along with a few different options you could implement depending on if you're looking to keep things really simple or if you want to challenge yourself a bit. Either way, the minimum amount of tools that you'd need to build this entire thing are a circular saw and a drill. Well, technically I guess you don't need to have a drill, but I'll assume that you have one. And actually, if a drill is a bridge too far, then you probably don't have a phone or a computer and you're not even watching me right now. So I'm talking to nobody. Anyhow, we're going to jump into how to build this thing in a minute, but first I want to tell you why you should build it. Or why I am, at least. So this came about as part of a challenge to build a TV stand fit for a man cave. Now when you think of man cave, this probably isn't the style that you think of. But that's beside the point. Because at the end of the day, the star of the man cave isn't the media console. It's the thing sitting on top of it, the TV. And this stand is going to make your TV better. Here's how. So let's assume that in 2018, the typical man cave is going to be sporting a TV that's about 65 inches. Well, the ideal viewing height is for the center of the TV to be at eye level, and eye level for the average seated person is right around 42 inches off the ground. This means that the top of your TV stand should be somewhere in the 20 to 22 inch neighborhood. So if you have the room, think low and long, more like this, not like that. I'm going to be making mine out of 2 sheets of 3/4 inch and 1 sheet of 1/4 inch walnut veneered plywood. Whether you have a table saw or not, I recommend breaking down your sheet goods with a circular saw. In my mind, it's just safer, especially if you're working by yourself. So first I set my saw so that the depth of the cut was just a little bit more than the thickness of the material. Then I measured the distance from the side of my saw's base piece to the blade. Spoiler alert, it was 4 inches. And then I could start cutting. Here I'm measuring and marking at 22 3/4 inch. I want the width of my top, bottom, and side pieces to be about 18 3/4 inches, so I'm just adding 4 to that for the base piece. By the way, if you're wondering what that stuff under the wood is, it's a piece of foam insulation. After I had ripped 3 pieces, a top, a bottom, and what will be used for the sides, I started cross-cutting things to finished lengths. The top and bottom pieces are going to be 94 inches long each, so I marked a line and then used a speed square as a straight edge to make the cut. Now you could cut every single piece for the cabinet using these 2 methods, but if you have a table saw, you can definitely speed things up for yourself, so I'm going to make the next series of cuts using mine. First up are going to be the 2 side pieces. As you just saw, I had previously ripped them to width using the circular saw, and now we're going to cut them to their finished lengths of 16.5 inches. And while I'm busy cutting away the rest of the pieces that make up the cabinet, let me go ahead and give you those dimensions. So we've already discussed the 4 outer pieces, so the only thing remaining are the vertical partition, a shelf, and a little vertical piece to support the shelf. All of these pieces are going to be a little bit narrower to leave room for some sliding doors. So you're going to want to rip these pieces to about 16 inches wide. After that, you can finalize the center vertical partition at 16.5 inches, the same as the 2 side pieces. But for the shelf and the vertical shelf support piece, you should wait until you're assembling things and cut it to fit. So we'll come back to those. And while I'm finishing that up, I'd like to thank my sponsor for this week, True Value. Chances are that there's a True Value hardware store not too far from you. I have 2 within about a 4-mile radius of me, and I've gone there at least a few times a year for the past several years. But in preparing for this video, I decided to do something different. I stopped by unannounced, not that they'd have any idea who I am or what Foureyes furniture is, and I asked if I could talk to the owner. I wanted to get a better sense of who they were and what they were about. So this is Scott. He's been at this location for nearly 40 years, and I was shocked to learn that this specific store has actually been in Whittier for 75 years. If it sounds like I'm overreacting, you have to realize that in Southern California, almost nothing has been around for that long. Anyhow, I wanted to get a sense of what the True Value difference is, and after speaking with him and a few other associates, if I had to boil it down in my own words, I'd describe it as the feeling and helpfulness of a small-town hardware store, but with the conveniences and selection of a big box store. Okay, so now for the announcement. Right now, True Value is going to give away a truly spectacular gift to one lucky person. And I'm going to put some information in a link below so that you can get all the details, but let's just say that if you're a maker, DIYer, or you aspire to be, this has the potential to literally change your life. So scroll down to the description and don't skip on this. Alright, thanks True Value, and thanks Scott for taking the time to chat. Let's get back to the build. So before you start assembling things, it's a good idea to do a little pre-sanding on the insides of the panels. It's just a lot easier to reach them right now. You'll notice in this shot that there's a couple grooves in the piece that I'm working on here. Those are going to be for a sliding door. They're optional, so after we get done with assembly, I'll come back and talk about them. And while we're on the topic of options, another option you could, well, opt for, I guess, for lack of a better word, is some hardwood edging. I'm not going to do it on this piece, and I actually don't mind the look of plywood layers, but if you wanted to, you could cut thin pieces of hardwood and glue them on, or use some store-bought edge banding. I've gone over the hardwood strip methods in a few other videos, so I'll link those below if you're interested in checking them out. As for the actual assembly though, I'm going to be using glue and screws. That said, you could easily use just one or the other and this thing would come out plenty strong. I started by attaching the two side pieces to the bottom piece. Since these won't ever be visible, I didn't bother trying to conceal my screw heads. Once those were attached, I marked the center of my cabinet and installed the vertical partition the same way. While those were drying, I cut the vertical shelf support to its final length. For me, that ended up being 7 7/8 of an inch. I only need one, but you'll notice in this shot that I'm cutting 3. The 2 extra are just going to be there to help me balance the horizontal shelf when that gets installed. Then I found the center between the side panel and the vertical partition and glued in my shelf support piece. Next, I could cut my shelf piece to its final length. And this is the one that you really want to hold off on and cut to fit. So here I'm making a mark and then purposefully erring on the side of too long. To cut the piece to length, I went back to the circular saw because it was about 45 inches long, which is more than the table saw could handle. And actually, even if it could, I think it's just safer to make this kind of cross-cut this way. It took me about 3 times of going back and forth, just nibbling away at the piece to get it to fit just right. Again, don't aim for a specific length in these situations. Just slowly work away at the piece until it fits just right. It takes a little longer initially, but it's worth it in the end. Anyhow, then I glued it in. Finally, I glued the top in place and secured it with a few clamps. I started on the right side, got that into place, and then glued and clamped the other side. Whenever possible, it makes life easier to break your gluing down into a few smaller steps rather than one big step. It makes the whole thing a lot less tense. While that was drying, I pre-drilled for some screws to go in. But before I installed them, I used a 3/8 inch bit to countersink about 1/4 of an inch deep. And then once the screws were in, I cut a few pieces of 3/8 dowel and used those to conceal the screw heads. After they were glued in and dried, I cleaned them up using a flush trim saw and a sander. And then the last thing to do was to install a back panel. I'm not going to give you the dimensions for this piece because there are a number of ways you could go about it. That said, if you want to hide cords, it's probably a good idea to at least do something. I suppose the most effective way would be to make a panel that covers the whole cabinet and then just drill in a few holes to feed your cords through. But I opted for a partially open back. I wanted some of the white of the wall to show through because I felt like it just visually lightens things a bit. Any way you decide to go, just cut your pieces to size and then you can hold them on with a few nails. Alright, so now let's back up for a minute and talk about the doors. At the end of the day, prior to the shots you've been seeing of me assembling the case, I routed a pair of grooves into the bottom piece and the top piece. These are going to hold the sliding doors. I used a palm router and a 1/4 inch bit. It's pretty straightforward and there's really only 2 tricks. 1, cut the slots so that they stop about 1/2 of an inch short of the edge of your pieces, that way they can't be seen from the outside. And 2, cut the grooves in the top piece considerably deeper than the grooves in the bottom piece. I didn't use any measurements here, but I guess that my bottom grooves are about 1/8 of an inch deep, and my top grooves are around 3/8 to 1/2 inch deep. This is what's going to enable you to install and remove the doors as needed. You'll see what I'm talking about in a second. Alright, so back to the next day. While the box was gluing up, I cut my doors to size. You can cut them to any length that you want, but the height should be the size of the distance between your top and bottom pieces, plus the depth of your bottom groove, plus a little bit more. So let's just say that you have a 16-inch gap and an 1/8-inch groove in the bottom. Well, then you're just going to want to tack in an extra 1/8 of an inch or so, and you could cut your piece to 16¼ inches. These are just hypotheticals. In this shot here, you can see how it allows you to put the door in or take it out by lifting so that it bottoms out in the top groove and clears the bottom panel. And also, since it isn't binding, it slides really easily. Now, again, even if you do want the doors, you could actually just stop right here, but I'm gonna go a little bit further and cut a finger grab into my doors. You could do this with a handheld drill, but it's a lot easier if you have a drill press. So I just measured 3 inches in from either edge, and then used a 1 3/8 inch Forstner bit and cleared out a circular cutout. I also placed a piece of scrap wood on the underside to avoid tear out in the back, and also to avoid trying to drill into metal, I suppose. I wanted a pop of color on my doors, so that night and the next morning, I rolled a few coats of paint onto them. And this is a great way to pay homage to your favorite team, whether that's the Lakers, or the Steelers, or the Bears, or the Lakers. You're covered. And with that, the cabinet is finished and we can turn our attention to the base. So again, you have options here. If you wanted to keep things as simple as possible, you could just set it on the ground, I guess. But if you want to go one step further, you could get a set of hairpin legs. I'll throw a link below if you want to try to use these ones out, but anyhow, to install them, you basically just set them where you want them and then mount them with a few screws. Easy peasy. But if you want a little bit more of a challenge, or you don't like that look for whatever reason, I'm going to show you how to build a pretty simple base out of your remaining plywood. To start, we're going to rip 4 long strips. Mine are 70 inches long and about 1.5 inches wide. Next, set those aside and rip another long piece 2¼ inches wide. Then with that piece, you're going to cross-cut 8 pieces at 4 inches long and 8 pieces at 2½ inches long. Whenever you're cross-cutting pieces like this on a table saw, make sure to use a spacer block like you see here clamped to my fence. That way when the workpiece hits the blade, it's not pinched between the blade and the fence, and it can't kick back at you. Also use a miter gauge. Once we have all of our pieces cut out, we can start gluing up our leg assemblies. To start, I made 4 assemblies of feet like you see here. To do that, you just take 2 of the longer pieces and 2 of the shorter pieces and make this sort of U-shaped component. I'm just using glue and letting them dry up. You could clamp them, but I think you're more likely to do harm than good by misaligning things as you apply pressure. Once those have dried for about 30 minutes, depending on your weather, glue up 2 of the long strips, and here clamps actually help. And then put some glue in the U-shaped piece and assemble as you see here. Once both of those have dried, to attach them to the cabinet, flip everything upside down and mark things out so that you have the base piece centered and attach it. You could use just glue here if you wanted, but I used screws since I knew I was going to have to take them on and off for filming purposes. Next, give everything a good sanding up to 220 grit. I started with 180 and then did 220, but you could probably get away with just 220. And then put on a few coats of finish. I'm using a tung oil finish, but you could use wipe-on poly or pretty much anything that you like. You know, I'll be the first to admit that this TV stand doesn't exactly epitomize the term man cave. And furthermore, I don't often look at myself in the mirror and think that I necessarily exude manliness. But be it man cave TV stand, or man, we all come in different shapes and sizes. Some of us are tall and skinny, others are low and long. Some of us are walnut with blue and red doors, and some of us are rustic farmhouse. And for as mixed as this metaphor is becoming, at the end of the day, we all share one extremely specific thing in common. We all love Mario, and we all need a place to get away from our kids and their fidget spinners.
5.
Thanks for watching, and don't forget to check out Crafted Workshop's Man Cave build as well. At the time of recording this, I have to admit that I haven't actually seen what Johnny's building, but I'll venture to guess that it's probably a little bit more manly than mine. Also, make sure to hit that subscribe button, and I'll see you next time.